I was in Leeds in 2017 on a rainy afternoon in September, and having some time to waste, I visited the Royal Armoury. Quite apart from the fact that it's a truly magnificent display covering all ages of arms and armour, I was particularly taken by a tableau representation of the battlefield at Agincourt. It was presented in such a way that I became quite intrigued by not only the battle itself, but also by the events leading up to it. The soldiers, the weapons, the armour, indeed all of the accoutrements and personnel involved, as well as the mood extant in France at the time, are integral to the success of the campaign. I'd like to look at the most important of these before arriving at the battle itself. Some aspects of the battle are almost scenes of high comedy, but more of that later. Let me first of all try to explain how the battle came to be fought in the first place. During the ongoing and spasmodic 100 Years' War, Henry V had determined to reassert his claim to the crown of France and sovereignty over lands within France, and in the April of 1415 set about raising an army. Raising an army in late medieval England was no mean feat, and was paid by means of indentures of war, which were contracts drawn up between the king and fellow earls, knights and esquires, who were to raise a stipulated number of men-at-arms, that's armoured and mounted soldiers, and archers. There were a total of 290 indentures for retinues who were to assemble or muster in and around the port of town of Southampton by the 1st of July. Henry's army was eventually made up of some 3,000 men-at-arms or lancers and 9,000 archers. A man-at-arms was a mounted, heavily armed soldier who may fight as a mounted cavalry or more generally fought on foot during a battle, and each of the men-at-arms would generally have had a page. The primary weapon of the man-at-arms on horseback would be the lance, which was essentially a simple spear, 12 feet or almost 4 meters in length. In the Battle of Agincourt, unmounted men-at-arms cut down their lances to a more manageable size of 5 feet or 1.5 meters. Each man-at-arms would likely also have had a sword. Some of the two-handed type were favoured by the gentry, or various forms of mace or club and dagger. The archers, all skilled in the use of the longbow, were drawn from English and Welsh peasantry, and attracted by not just a wage of 6pence a day, but also by the significant earnings which could accrue from prisoner ransom. Among the ranks were 500 Welsh archers and 23 men-at-arms, mostly from the Carmarthen, Cardigan, Brecon and Monmouthshire regions. The archers would also have variously carried swords, daggers, hatchets and warhammers. In medieval warfare, the longbow was a devastatingly effective weapon. It is reputed to have been invented by the Celts in Wales around 1180, although archaeological evidence suggests that it was the Middle Stone Age which saw the emergence of the proto-longbow, subsequently to become what was called the warbow. The longbow is an incredibly strong piece of wood, usually yew, roughly 6 feet or 1.8 meters tall. The ideal length was just greater than the height of the archer. The longbow was an awesome weapon, with a draw of anything up to 150 pounds, that's 70 kilos, and in the hands of a skilled archer, it could send an arrow anything up to 300 meters. A broadhead arrow was most commonly used against horses, and could also penetrate chainmail with ease, whilst a bodkin could be lethal even through plate armour. A principal and highly effective use of archers against cavalry and foot soldiers was the use of an arrow storm, a blitz of arrows which caused devastating effect against the attacking force. Under Henry II, the English archery law of the 13th century ensured that English men would become experts with the bow and arrow, when, in 1252, the Assize of Arms ensured that all Englishmen were ordered by law that every man between the age of 15 to 60 years old should equip themselves with the bow and arrows. Edward III took this further and decreed the Archery Law in 1363, which commanded the obligatory practice of archery on Sundays and holidays. Skill in the use of the longbow took considerable time, and by the enforcement of these laws, the English invested in the time required. The longbow required many years of training and great strength to use effectively, whereas the crossbow was simple to teach and could be used effectively by anyone after very little training. Although French armies did have some longbow archers, they depended almost entirely on the crossbow. So deadly was the crossbow, and so easy was it for a raw recruit to use effectively, that the Roman Catholic Church once attempted to ban the weapon from warfare. The Church considered it one of the most destabilizing weapons of the time. The crossbow may have been easier to use than the longbow, but this did not make it more effective in the open battlefield. In fact, during field battles, the longbow had a clear advantage over its counterpart. Not only could a longbow fire further than a crossbow, but a longbowman's average rate of fire was significantly greater than that of a crossbowman. It's said that the best archers were able to fire an arrow every 5 seconds with accuracy. A crossbowman, on the other hand, could only fire at about half the speed of a longbowman, and on average could fire no more than 3 or 4 bolts a minute. His slow reload time was due to his need to use mechanical devices to draw back the bowstring before he could load the bolt and fire the weapon. This cost the wielder precious seconds. Henry's army of soldiers was supported by tent makers, tailors, shoemakers, bowyers, armourers, wheelwrights, labourers, carpenters, stonemasons, smiths, miners and waggoners, and by a 30-strong company of German gunners. Royal artillery had become an essential weapon of siege warfare by the reign of Henry V, and these weapons were constructed at the Tower of London. Unfortunately, these weapons were liable to break and explode under the strain of firing. However, despite this, Henry made great efforts to obtain guns for the 1415 expedition. This included the purchase of £18,000 of iron for the construction of guns in the Tower of London and 10,000 gunstones, which were to be used as ammunition. The king also had his chapel, headed by its dean, and 17 minstrels, as well as his physician and 2 surgeons. The total number of participants was therefore larger than simply the paid troops, although household officials and servants often served as soldiers. This was certainly the case for those of the royal household, where men from all departments, from the bakehouse to the chamber, both served in person and brought along a few archers each. Within other retinues were archers who had particular occupations. At least one man was a dyer. Others included butchers, bakers, brewers, tailors, bladesmiths, barbers and such like, no doubt providing useful services to their fellow soldiers, as well as contributing to military strength. The geographical origins of the troops were diverse. And don't forget the horses. Each man-at-arms would have had at least 2 horses, and many of the archers would also have had a horse. In addition, there were the baggage horses. There would likely have been as many as 20,000 horses. The logistics of transporting overseas an army of this size were not trivial. At the core of the naval transport fleet were the king's ships. By the end of his reign, Henry V possessed just 36 vessels. So many additional vessels were needed to transport this enormous army, and ships were requisitioned by the crown from among the 200 seaports existing in the country at that time. In addition, some 250 ships were hired from Holland and Zealand. In all, some 700 ships formed the transport fleet, manned by over 16,000 mariners. Henry would sail aboard his flagship, the Trinity Royal, of 540 tons. On the 11th of August, Henry set sail from Southampton with an army of about 12,000 fighting soldiers and the whole host of supporting personnel, horses, supplies and baggage. On the 14th, Henry's army landed in Normandy on the Seine estuary, close to the port of Harfleur. Henry's first aim was to capture Harfleur and use it as a base for any future operations. More than 2,000 men-at-arms and nearly 9,000 archers, together with several hundred masons, carpenters, labourers, and the German gunners, were deployed. The subsequent siege prompted William Shakespeare's soliloquy, "Once more into the breach, dear friends." The siege of Harfleur lasted over 4 weeks and ended on the 22nd of September, when the defenders finally surrendered, but at a high price for Henry. In the cramped and insanitary conditions of the siege, disease was rampant, and after deaths and repatriations through sickness were accounted for, Henry was left with no more than 6,000 men. Replacements from England added no more than a further 1,000, so Henry's campaign was reduced to just 7,000 soldiers, many of whom were in extremely poor health. France was at the time a divided nation, with the 2 factions of the House of Burgundy and the House of Orléans at odds. On the throne was Charles VI of Orléans, who experienced periodic bouts of insanity, during which he believed he was made of glass and had to be bound with leather and then encased in hoops in case he might break into pieces. His son, Louis de Guienne, the Dauphin and heir to the French throne, was dissolute, fat and sluggish, normally rising at 4 p.m. and spending the night in a series of drunken debauches. So France was a nation with no effective figurehead, and was ill prepared to counter any serious attack on its territory, which stood very much in Henry's favour as he prepared to march forth. Whilst neither the French king nor his son was inclined to show any kind of military resistance, that was not the case among the French nobility. The oriflamme, the sacred banner used by kings of France at times of great danger to the nation, once unfurled, was effectively a call to arms. And on the 10th of September, Guillaume Martel, Lord of Bacqueville, carried the banner from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the burial place of French kings, to Rouen, where it was unfurled a few days later. At this point, the mood of the country began to change. Fresh recruits poured in, and by the end of September had grown to over 14,000 men, and was still growing. The force was led by French aristocrats such as Marshal Boucicaut and the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret. This force now represented a serious threat to Henry, and he concluded that they should pass from Harfleur to Calais, following the overland route, anticipating that they would be met en route by the French. On the 8th of October, Henry V and his army marched out of Harfleur. Assuming a rapid and controlled march towards Calais, a distance of some 170 miles, they left most of their baggage behind and took only sufficient stores for 8 days, carried on the backs of horses. Morale was high, and they were ready for a fight. The countdown to the Battle of Agincourt had begun. The force took the coastal route northeast of Harfleur, passing the towns of Fécamp, Arques and Eure. By the 13th of October, they were advancing toward the Somme and the ford at Blanchetaque. Henry supposed that the French army at Rouen would follow them and offer battle before they reached the river. The king drew up his army on a broad plain before the crossing and arrayed themselves in order of battle. But there was no challenge, and unexpectedly and alarmingly, Blanchetaque was found to be heavily guarded by enemy soldiers. Furthermore, it was learned from a prisoner that the Burgundians had begun to support the French war effort, and d'Albret and Boucicaut were amassing a second army on the far side of the Somme. Crossing points were now held by the French, creating a serious problem for Henry. Henry's army was now forced to march upriver, following the course of the Somme, past Amiens, and continuing to find all crossing points held by the French. Virtually out of supplies and still suffering heavily from dysentery, the army was desperate to find an undefended river crossing. And eventually, on the 19th of October, rough causeways were constructed between the villages of Voyens and Betancourt, and the English began to move across the Somme. In the meantime, to the west of the Somme, the two French armies had converged and were now ahead of the English route to Calais. Henry's army then moved north with a much larger French force on their right flank. Between the 21st and 23rd of October, they kept up an impressive marching speed, even though ill-nourished. And on the 24th of October, the army crossed the river Ternoise at Blagny, having progressed almost 100 miles in just over 3 days. A huge French force was ahead of them. In the early afternoon, a tired, starving and bedraggled English army of under 7,000 men approached the village of Maisoncelles. Beyond the village, the French army came into sight, well fed, well provisioned, and well supplied. A mass of knights and men-at-arms spilling across the valley from the east. Seeing that he could not pass without giving battle, Henry ordered his army to encamp and prepared to fight the next day. That evening, an air of resignation hung over the English, caused by the heavy rain that began to fall, and the enormous French camp, 2 miles up the road, marked in the dark by myriads of twinkling fires, laughter and music. The French had little doubt but that they would prevail the next day. During the night, Henry made his way around his army, giving words of encouragement, again a dramatic episode made much of by Shakespeare. Battle was now imminent. It was considered a great honour in France to lead the vanguard into battle, and Boucicaut and d'Albret were both claiming the right to fight together with their soldiers on either side. Any other great lords who joined the army would follow behind. More dismounted men-at-arms were placed on the flanks of these two forces. In front of these groups was a screen of crossbowmen and archers, and just to one side an elite cavalry force of up to 1,000. In Boucicaut's plan, he envisaged a sequenced attack, intended to completely destroy Henry's army. The crossbowmen would open the fight and through their fire weaken the English line. Then The heavy cavalry would charge the archers, and at that point all the foot soldiers would advance together. Then the final French cavalry force would swing round behind the English position, crash through their baggage train, and strike the main force from behind. What could possibly go wrong? At around 8 p.m, the French had pulled back to the more open countryside north of the villages of Agincourt and Tramecourt. Boucicaut and D'Albret were content to play the waiting game, knowing that every hour brought them more reinforcements and further weakened Henry's already hungry forces. Although Boucicaut and D'Albret were military professionals, the French army was composed mostly of aristocratic retinues. Their forces were numerically large, but lacking in unity and cohesion, and it was with an outdated and exalted chivalric concept of honour that they believed they had the right to lead the army. The French regarded the majority of the English army with disdain, given the humble origins of the majority of their force, woodsmen and peasants. For the French aristocracy, the battle would be more about celebrating the superiority of their social class and less about military tactics. It seemed that all they had to do was stop the English soldiers fleeing the battlefield before celebrating a resounding victory. By midnight, it was raining heavily, and the ground was becoming increasingly waterlogged. A returning reconnaissance party working poor light, torrential rain and thick cloying mud reported to the king that the Calais road climbed slightly and then passed through a natural funnel bordered by woodland on either side, and with the land dropping away towards the villages of Agincourt and Tramecourt. Beyond the funnel, in the direction of Risseauville, the French forces were camped. If Henry occupied the narrow end of the funnel, which lay closest to the English army, he could secure the greatest protection for his archers and fight in the most advantageous position. The French also sent out a reconnaissance party to discover the English position, which they did, but with no analysis of the strategic location, assuming that victory was a foregone conclusion. Most of the English archers came from the established ranks of the peasantry. They were skilled in using the bow, but only a few could afford any expensive equipment. The minority would have perhaps a makeshift helmet and light chain mail, but the majority might just have a leather jerkin or jacket. Many were rendered barefoot by the time of the battle from the long, harrowing march from Harfleur. As the rival armies surveyed themselves, the class system was all too apparent. Described by the French as scum, one French chronicler wrote, "All with bare feet and no shoes, dressed in scruffy doublets made out of old bedding, a poor skull cap of iron on their heads, a bow and a quiver of arrows in their hand, and a sword hanging by their side. That was all the armour they had." By contrast, the French army turned up in all their finery, as if they were going to a tournament. They were adhering to a strict dress code, arranging their ranks by invitation only, and pushing their squires and servants to the rear. The two armies came into view just after 9 a.m. The extent of the grandeur of the French nobility was on display. Their army contained 4 royal dukes, 12 counts, and numerous lords. All the great military officials of France were in attendance. There were so many banners at the front of the French force that some had to be taken down and put away as they were blocking the way forward. Henry led his army out of Maisoncelles and lined up his men on top of the slight ridge. On either side was woodland. Henry took up position of his force of men-at-arms in the centre at the end of the funnel. On the right flank was Edward, Duke of York, on the left was Baron Camoys, and he interspersed these forces with several hundred archers. He then drew up his main force of archers and placed them in front on 2 wings, protected against cavalry charge by sharpened wooden stakes, and where the woodland gave them some further measure of protection. All Henry's troops were on foot. The archers hammered their protective stakes into the ground. All the men-at-arms were in a single line. There were no reserves. The French army was drawn up about 1,000 yards or 900 metres further north at the wide end of the funnel, where the ground broadened, giving them greater room to deploy. There's no accurate figure of the size of the French army, but it's generally accepted that 28,000 is a reasonable estimate. Marshal Boucicaut's original battle plan was largely gone now. The French had pushed the crossbowmen to the rear. There was still some cavalry on the flanks, but their huge vanguard occupied most of the space ahead, and it was crammed with aristocrats. Their squires and servants were also relegated to the back, along with the crossbowmen. On seeing this, Henry grasped the possibilities. With no opposing crossbowmen or a really strong cavalry presence, he could use his archers to their best effect. The French now had no overall commander, and judging from the array of banners, most of their chief aristocrats were in the vanguard, leaving the rest of the army virtually leaderless. The monk of Saint-Denis wrote with some humour. Each of the leaders claimed for himself the honour of leading the vanguard. This led to a considerable debate, and so that there could be some agreement, they came to the rather unfortunate conclusion that they should all place themselves in the front line. The modified French plan was simple. The cavalry would distract the archers on each flank, and the main body of men-at-arms would assail the English line with the force of a battering ram. The line of English men was no more than 4 deep, whereas the opposing French force was more than 30 deep. The odds were not looking good. The English army was on firm ground at the narrow end of the funnel, whereas between the English and French forces there was recently ploughed farmland, which was extremely waterlogged from the heavy rain of the preceding days. All the while, more reinforcements from Breton were on the way to swell even further the French army. Henry could wait no longer. He needed to provoke the French into action, and so proposed to wait only until the autumn morning sun was in the faces of his opponents. At 11 a.m, the formal order was given to advance banners, and Henry's main force moved slowly forward, issuing derisive sounds and cries. They intended only to make a limited advance of 50 yards in order to maintain the advantage of the dry, unploughed ground at the narrow end of the funnel. The archers in the front line amongst the men-at-arms then ran quickly forward towards the French as if to put them under arrow fire. At almost the same moment that the English started their slow advance, the French finally lost patience, and they launched their cavalry charge against the English archers. The main body of dismounted men-at-arms were then to follow behind them. However, most of the cavalry was deployed behind the front line of aristocrats, and so the initial charge of 1,000 strong, envisaged in Boucicault's original plan, was considerably reduced. It was said that because of the long wait, many of the horsemen had wandered off to find water and provision for their horses and could not quickly be found again. 2 hours earlier, 800 men had been assembled for the charge. Now only 140 could be found. The charge was over sticky, muddy ground, and the cavalry couldn't develop any speed. As they charged forward, the advanced group of archers in the main line retreated back into the woods on both sides and fired on the French cavalry. But the French target was the main body of archers on the right flank. As they advanced within range of the bowmen, they were met with a devastating arrow storm. It's estimated that the archers fired as many as 60,000 arrows a minute. A second wing of horsemen attacking the left flank and numbering some 300 fared little better. Some made it through to the archers' position, but were quickly surrounded and either pulled off their horses or shot down. Chaos ensued as horses became uncontrollable in the midst of the mayhem. The French cavalry attack, such an important part of Boucicault's original battle plan, had failed, and so it would now depend on the massed ranks of the infantry following up behind. There were 2 French formations of infantry moving forward, the vanguard and a short distance behind it the 2nd Division. The latter force was now leaderless, as the Duke of Alençon, who had been entrusted with his command, had, on impulse, decided to join the vanguard instead. At the beginning all went well, the line moving forward slowly to maintain their cohesion. However, the muddy terrain soon took its toll as they began struggling through the heavy cloying mud, weighed down by their heavy armour, which could weigh as much as 90 pounds. It was reported that the knights were armed with long coats of mail reaching below their knees and being very heavy. Below these they had leg harness, and above white harness, that's plate armour. In addition they had bassinets, helmets with visors, and aventails, chainmail collars. The ground was so soft that, quote, men-at-arms sank into it by at least a foot. In such atrocious conditions, it was the job of the pages and squires to help the men-at-arms. However, most had no one to help them, because they had not wanted to take with them any of the lower ranks, for the gentlemen wanted to have all the honour deriving from battle. Any knight who slipped and fell was in danger of being trampled, either by the massed ranks pushing up behind, or by many of the riderless horses still wandering about after the failed cavalry charges. As if that wasn't enough, they had now come within range of the main force of the English bowmen, and as was reported, the air was filled with a terrifying sound. A cloud burst in all directions, and iron sounded on iron as the volleys struck helmets, breastplates, and cuirasses. They were forced to lower their visors of their bassinet helmets. This offered some additional protection, but arrows could easily pierce the eye slits and ventilation holes, and so they took a reflex action to lower their heads. With the visor down, it was rather like wearing a diver's helmet, but without the oxygen supply. The wearer was plunged into disorientating blackness, with vision restricted to a single horizontal slit about half an inch wide. The French did eventually make it through the English line, but so exhausted were they that the English soldiers, still fresh, had little trouble in dispatching them, and the further ranks behind, funneled into ever narrower ground, pushed them forward, making movement ever more difficult. When some fell over, others fell with a domino effect. Once fallen down, an injured man could be fallen upon by other dead or injured and simply suffocate. Indeed, after the battle, many living soldiers were found beneath heaps of bodies. Shortly after midday, the crisis point of the battle had been reached. In spite of the crush and the incredibly difficult conditions, many of the French men-at-arms were breaking through in amongst the English soldiers, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting was taking place. The Duke of York and his men were defending his standard, surrounded by a great number of French. Realising that the entire battle plan depended on the English line holding, he stood firm, with blows raining all around and on him. He and his men prevailed, although suffering the majority of loss of life of the entire English army. The Duke of York was struck a fatal blow on the helmet, crushing his skull, but his valour and resolve had likely saved the day. Likewise, the king himself was in the midst of the fighting. If their banners went down, the day would likely be lost. The French would punch through their battle lines and envelop Henry's forces. The narrow funnel would then become a trap rather than an advantage. If some of the remaining French cavalry also rode around the field and broke through the baggage train, they could attack the English from the rear. All through this, imagine the noise: trumpets, hunting horns, cries of agony or triumph, and all the while the clash of steel on steel. The din must have been unbelievable. At this time, the archers, who had nothing much further to do in this close fighting, and in any case were pretty well out of ammunition, and despite the fact that they lacked armour, took up whatever was to hand, discarded weapons, wooden stakes, even the mallets used to hammer in the stakes, and strode into the melee. Under this new attack, the French began to recoil in disarray, and Henry now urged his men forward, forcing the French back into their comrades, floundering and falling in the mud. Terrible piles of bodies built, as much as 6 feet high, a chronicler's vivid and gory description of the scene. Men trod on their own entrails, others vomited forth their teeth, some still standing had their arms hacked off, and all around them, in the chaos of battle, the dying rolled in the blood of complete strangers. And another chronicler: it was a pitiful sight to see how, once their ranks had been broken, confusion spread amongst the French army, and how many of them tried to save their skins by fleeing. 10 Englishmen pursued 100 Frenchmen, and when they were caught, they put up no resistance. They let themselves be killed or led off captive like a flock of sheep. At this stage, the French Duke of Brabant, who had been on his way to join the French force with 1,400 men, had been delayed and was in the town of Lens, 30 miles away, when he received news that the battle was imminent, and so he, with no more than a dozen of his company, rode without delay to join the fray. When he arrived and perceived the situation, realising that the rest of his force would not arrive in time, nor would any of his equipment, armour, standards of penance, he borrowed some armour, and in a great act of courageous daring-do, he threw himself into the fight, but was almost immediately killed. He had arrived no more than 30 minutes before the end of the battle. In the meantime, Henry's baggage train had been attacked and plundered, and the third line of French appeared to be lining up for a charge. Henry's men were distracted and busily capturing French noblemen, for which significant bounty was paid, and when Henry heard that the Duke of Brabant had arrived, he was aware that many more fresh troops could arrive at any time. With Henry's archers out of ammunition and his force exhausted, there was a real possibility that they would be overrun, and so he ordered prisoners to be killed in order to release his otherwise distracted troops for further combat. Many soldiers were unwilling to carry out this order, not because of moral scruples, but because of the loss of ransom money. Once it became apparent to the French that their attempt would likely be stoutly resisted, their line hesitated and began to drift away. When Henry saw the threat had passed, he immediately rescinded the kill order. Horrific as this sounds, it was strategically the only sensible decision, and not without precedent. In the Battle of Crecy, Edward III ordered that no prisoners be taken alive. Medieval warfare was brutal on a scale we can barely imagine, and for the previous 200 years of crusades, the level of slaughter of innocents and prisoners alike was commonplace. It was 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon on the 25th of October, and the Battle of Agincourt was finally over. The English had won a stunning victory against enormous odds. Accounts vary, but it's generally accepted that French losses were anything from 6 to 8,000, whereas the English losses were no more than 2 to 400. Included were the Duke of York, Earl of Suffolk, and Dafydd Gam, enemy of Owen Glendower. The victory was due in part to Henry's brilliance and the outstanding resolve of his army, but also the French outdated and misguided sense of chivalric honour, and their arrogance and sense of entitlement was a very major factor in a defeat which has and will resonate for centuries. The following day, Henry and his army continued the march towards Calais, arriving there 3 days later. His march across France had come to an end.